Joining us live now is Greens Senator all the way from Hobart, Tasmania, Nick McKim. Nick, thank you for joining us this morning. Now, the big story for Labor tonight is their first vision speech from leader Anthony Albanese after the election loss, and a big focus will be their climate policy. They're saying that their climate policy needs to focus on jobs. Surely Greens can agree with that?
Sure, there's heaps of jobs available if we take a strong policy on renewable energy and other elements of the climate debate, but there's not a lot to see here from Anthony Albanese's speech. I'm sorry to have to be the one to tell Anthony, but Labor's target of 50% renewables by 2030 is going to be delivered under a business as usual scenario, and ultimately the climate science is abundantly clear. We need to stop digging up coal and burning it to generate electricity, and until Labor have a policy that actually reflects and responds to that very clear climate science, they still cannot claim to be taking strong action on climate change.
You're becoming an increasingly small group in the Parliament, though. We've had a number of Labor MPs in the last few days be quite vocal about their support for coal and how it is going to support the economy. Aren't there concerns if you completely ripped coal out of the equation, how we'd get our power?
Well, absolutely, we have to make sure it's a managed transition, and that's why government needs to get involved and not just leave it to the market, because ultimately the market will bail out of coal, and the real risk there is that communities that rely on coal to generate wealth and to generate income are going to be left behind in the transition. That's why we need to make sure it's a managed transition, and it's why we need to make sure it's a just transition, and that communities that currently do rely on coal are eased through the transition, but doing nothing and not making that transition is simply not an option, and that's very clear from the science.
This is a very deliberate move by the Labor Party. This is really the first policy statement we've heard since the election. How are you possibly going to influence Labor leader Anthony Albanese when he really wants to hang his hat on this?
Well, look, Mr Albanese will do what Mr Albanese does. That's not in our control. What we can control is the positions that we take, and as always, the Greens' position will be based on the very clear science that is available. I mean, we simply cannot keep digging up burning coal to generate electricity. About 80% of the coal that we dig up in Australia is exported overseas and burned overseas to generate electricity, and simply put, we need no new coal mines in Australia that rely on either delivering coal to the onshore electricity generation sector or the offshore electricity generation sector. And again, until Labor's got a position that reflects climate science, they are still part of the problem and are not taking the opportunity to be part of the solution.
Labor's blamed the Greens for their election loss in part. We've had Bill Shorten saying that you guys running around Queensland wasn't helping their case at all. Do you take any responsibility for Labor's loss?
No, I think Labor should have a bit of a look in the mirror rather than start throwing rocks at the Greens. What we're going to do is keep advocating based on what the climate science is telling us, and I can assure whether it's Mr Shorten or Mr Albanese or anyone else inside the Labor Party, we're not going to change our policies to suit the Labor Party. What we're going to keep doing is put forward a robust set of policies that actually delivers us on what the science is telling us needs to happen. And if Labor don't like that, that's a matter for them. My advice to Labor is to have a read of the IPCC work, understand that we are in an emergency here. Business as usual has brought us to the edge of the precipice, and we absolutely need to take strong action across a whole range of economic sectors, including strip mining our native forests, which we are still doing in Tasmania and Victoria and other parts of the country, and stop digging up and burning fossil fuels to generate electricity, whether that be thermal coal or whether that be fracking for natural gas.
Now, we've seen protesters this morning really causing quite a stir. It has turned violent, their protest against this mining conference. They've blocked one of the main thoroughfares from the suburbs into the Melbourne CBD. Do you think they've gone too far?
Look, I never condone, and the Greens never condone violence. We absolutely support people engaging in civil disobedience to have their voices heard, but it has to be peaceful and it has to be non-violent. So I'm not across the details of what's happened. If there was any violence from those protesters, absolutely I condemn that and urge them to stay peaceful. But when you've got a situation where governments, including both major political parties in this country, are simply not taking the action that is abundantly clear needs to be taken in response to the climate emergency, you are going to get people on the streets and you are going to get people ever more angry and frustrated. And that's why what we need in this country is for the major parties, and particularly the Labor Party, who have much more of a chance to make a move in this space than the LNP do. We need to see them picking up the science and making sure their policies reflect the science. And while that still is failing to happen, you will see more and more people on the streets, and power to their arms as long as they're being peaceful and non-violent.
I seem to recall some photos of you back in the day chaining yourself to machinery. You're certainly not opposed to at least making people's work lives hard like we've seen with these protesters this morning.
No, I have been involved in forest actions down in Tasmania in the mid-1980s, got arrested down there and proud to have been arrested because what the science is telling us now is that we cannot keep strip mining and burning our native forests in Australia. And one of the quickest ways we could reduce global emissions is actually to avoid deforestation. So, me and the many other hundreds of people that have been arrested in Tasmania's forests over the years, including, I might add, some people who've been arrested in the last week and a half up in Tarkine, which is the largest temperate rainforest in Australia, which is being strip mined at the moment by under the auspices of the Tasmanian government, and there are people being arrested in a blockade up there. Genuinely, I think they're heroes, and I believe that there will be more and more civil unrest and civil disobedience until governments and both major parties get with the program.
So you support protesters ignoring police orders to move on?
Absolutely. If people want to get arrested to make their point, I've done that myself in the past, and I'm not going to criticise people for doing that now. Ultimately, the police have the powers they need to make arrests. They have made arrests. People will be charged as the police see fit, and they'll go through the justice system. I mean, that's what the justice system is here to do. The simple fact is people are feeling strongly enough about these issues, whether it be deforestation, whether it be the ongoing digging up and burning of coal and fossil fuels to generate electricity. They feel strongly enough about the climate emergency to put their bodies on the line, and they're doing that because the major parties have simply failed to listen to them.
And just finally, it seems like with the sitting calendar the way it is, it's unlikely we'll see any kind of test of the Medevac legislation, regardless of where those crossbench senators sit, but it's still likely to be a very pertinent conversation towards the end of the year.
Yeah, it sure is. And look, I presume that we will see the Medevac repeal legislation sometime towards the end of this year. Look, I sat on the Senate committee that inquired into this legislation. The overwhelming preponderance of evidence was that Medevac has saved lives. And ultimately, the question for all of us, including the crossbenchers whose votes are in play here, is very simple. Do you think desperately ill people, many of whom I might add are desperately mentally ill because of the harm that Australia has caused them over nearly 7 years now of indefinite detention in PNG and on Nauru, do you think those people with their desperate illnesses should be under the control of doctors, or do you think they should be under the control of politicians like Peter Dutton? And I know where I stand on that. I know where the medical community stands on that. I know where most Australians stand on that, and that is let's let doctors make decisions about medical treatment, not bureaucrats and politicians.